simply start. And thanks very much to the RAI and so forth for organising this. This is, in a sense, an official RAI event, but it is in fact an informal event amongst people with interest in reproduction and friends of the Reproduction and Fertility Studies group, and our publisher and other interested parties. So we welcome the contributions from everybody to the discussion. The format today will be basically that I will introduce Marianne Berghorn, who is our publisher, to say a few words. My role really is confined just to sort of introducing the fertility group to anyone who may not be familiar with it, and actually just looking at the really quite remarkable track record of what it is Soraya and Marcia and Marianne have been doing. Then I will hand over to the main part of our event, which is actually a kind of interview by Marcia of Soraya. So without more ado, let me invite Marianne to come up and join me here, say whatever you want to say, Marianne.
Yeah, I want to say hello, welcome everybody, and I'm absolutely delighted. This is a wonderful occasion, and this, I must say, it's one of our most successful series, or maybe I should say I'm so glad Marcia made it all the way across the Atlantic, as I did, as a couple of days ago, come here, and Alice Waterston, previous president of the AAA, who we meet in New York every so often, and then a couple of days or so, you sent me an email, said, I happen to be in London on Friday, but it's probably asked too much for you to come all the way from Oxford. And then I could say, oh, so happens, there's an event in London, so I will be there. And yeah, what a wonderful opportunity here for us all to get together and to meet. But I want, primarily I'm delighted because the series is one of our most successful ones. It's now even beyond volume 50, which was the original reason why we decided to have a celebration, because we are now nearing volume 60, so it's one of I would say, most, if not the most successful series. And when I was first offered Soraya to publish the series, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. You remember before I said, oh, there's sex in it, that's always sells, so let's have a go. And yeah, I was right, but there's a lot more in it. And it's so topical, couldn't be more topical all the time. You know, here you have about male childlessness and breastfeeding, abortion, and so on. So it couldn't be more topical and more important for current days discussions. But I wanted to thank Soraya in particular, with whom we have worked together for 20 years now. Even more than that. So that's quite a while. And we always meet when I'm back in Oxford. She comes up for a cup of coffee, and then we chat about the series and some other important matters. And so it's absolutely wonderful to work with you person to person, and with Marcia sort of more long distance. But it's a wonderful cooperation, and I really want to thank you for it.
Thank you.
Okay. One of the things that I realized that I forgot to do is to say who I am. The Fertility and Reproduction Studies Group was founded in 1998 in conversations between Soraya and David Parkin, who was then the All Souls Professor of Anthropology in Oxford, the senior professor. The series was underway by 2001 when the first volume, which was edited by Soraya, was published. So it is worth pointing out that Marianne was, in a sense, at the ground floor very early. And none of us at that stage, and of course I was a kind of minor person who was on the advisory board, knew really how successful and what an enduring accomplishment this was going to be. I mean, this is really the first bespoke Center for Fertility and Reproduction, sexuality added to it, as Mary has pointed out, but not just for commercial reasons. And the function of the group really was to coordinate research across different universities in Europe initially, but also the United States and Australia and elsewhere on these subjects. And we have continued to develop this, as well as becoming not merely an anthropology-based institute, which of course we remain, but because the area of fertility and reproduction is so interdisciplinary across demography, biology, and natural sciences and other subjects. So we've built some really fine bridges in the course of reaching 50 years of publication, and we have carried out various functions in the university. I mean, obviously we have run seminars, several of which have become books. I have come this morning from giving lectures at the Reproduction Institute, which is part of the Nuffield Department of Medicine, a series which I give every year to their students. They are basically master's students doing a one-year IVF training course. They are from all over the world. I was very struck that there were only 2 Brits out of the 30 this year. A very interesting group, almost all with either clinical or, let's say, obstetrics and gynecology or more basic biological backgrounds. And of course, the role of FRSG, which I'm exercising in giving these lectures, is, to provide them with a framework for, in a sense, the demography and epidemiology of infertility around the world in history, which most people don't know about, and I'll be willing to bet most people in this audience don't know about it. I mean, do you know that, in fact, large parts of the world, 12 to 25% of women normally have not had children, for a lot of different reasons in different historical periods, but that goes back at least to the 16th century in Europe. So I then, of course, have the responsibility of doing the things which FRSG has focused particularly on, which has to do with, if you like, the culture and the experience of reproduction, how it varies, what the constraints are on it, and why it is that, in a sense, there is so much stigma, shame, unhappiness, and other problems that are associated with it. So, as Marianne was saying, we are, in a period which is now, my demographic colleagues refer to it as lowest low fertility. We are very topical in Europe, but in fact, the issues of pathological sterility and AIDS across much of the global south, issues of change in gender, and other issues that affect women's ability to have children, either helping them or hindering them, as the case may be, and other subjects remain very constant. The book series itself, in 25 years, we've produced more than 50 volumes, Soraya. And I have to say, I'm not making this up at all. The 2 people who are going to be talking to you after me, Soraya and Marcia, have done the lion's share of the work of managing the series. It is really their accomplishment, obviously, along with Marianne's. And I have been a silent partner, in a sense, feeding various publications and making connections and so forth. But in terms of really running the series and the quality of it, it's those 3 people who should be thanked on this occasion. I'm sorry to briefly be rather serious. But the things that are in that series, obviously, new reproductive technologies. I can say to this group of IVF students, look, here's a series of 50 books. About 2/5 of them actually are directly relevant to what you're learning. And, it doesn't make any difference if it's Oman or Ghana or Colombia, you're going to find it in this series. But then, in addition to that, of course, all of the other issues, particularly having to do with genetics, illness, and inheritance, with as aspects of nutrition, breastfeeding, midwifery, miscarriage, the full range of what comes into the study of reproduction. And also part of that series, several volumes, of which Marcia is responsible for at least one, actually having to reconsider male fertility as part of this whole discussion. So I think really, having come along for the second half of the 25 years, I've moved into what was really a going concern, and I've helped keep ticking over. But it is excellent that RAI and Berghahn should wish to have this meeting to mark this, because I don't think there's anything like it anywhere. It is a real accomplishment, and to RAI's credit too. And with that, what I should do is hand over to the main part of this, which is going to be a conversation between Soraya Tremayne, our founder director, and Masha Inhorn, both of whom basically are specialists in Islam, very different sorts of Islam, amongst other things, which you'll be glad to know figures very prominently in the lectures I give to these RGF students, as well as human sciences. But I hand over to the two of them to have a conversation about whatever you think you should talk about, right? So why don't you come up here, and I'll move to one side so that I can keep an eye on the screen if people then have questions. And I look forward to our discussion at the end of their conversation, when I will come back on the screen. Yeah, no, it's best if you all together.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for both of those very lovely introductions. I have to say, honestly, without Marian Berghahn, there would be thousands less incredible anthropological volumes published. She's one of the very few, maybe the only woman publisher, and you specialize in anthropology, and you do us a great service by, you know, having so many series and remarkable books that are coming out with Berghahn books. So thank you, Marian. And thank you, Phil, for keeping things afloat, especially the Fertility Reproduction Studies group at Oxford University, and for your lovely introduction to what that is and its history. What we're going to do today, I just want to say a few words. It's going to be a series of questions that I'm going to pose to Soraya. So I want to say just a few words about Soraya, and then she's going to read a bit of the preface to her book, which sort of sets the stage. And then I have a list of questions, knowing her work very well and knowing this book very well as I do. I'm going to ask her a series of questions that I think are relevant, and we'll try to wrap it up so that there's some time for questions from the audience and from the audience online. But what I'd like to say about Soraya, who's a very dear friend and colleague, is that really you've been a game changer in this world that Phil introduced, this world of fertility, reproduction, and sexuality, by doing these two remarkable things. The first was starting this very early group at Oxford, the Fertility and Reproduction Studies group, which became a sort of regular colloquium series. You've had many people over the years speak in that series. I was invited, I couldn't come back in the early 2000s, but it was a unique series, and it really started before a lot of the other centers in Britain focusing on reproduction. And then with Marian, way back at the end of the 1990s, you started this book series called Fertility, Reproduction, and Sexuality, and it has really been an amazing series. There are now 55 physically published books, and with, you know, several more coming down the pike. And I have to say, you know, no hubris intended here, but I do think it is really the leading series in the anthropology of reproduction, which is a growing subspecialty. And we have one of the other leaders over here, Sarah Franklin, who runs the reproductive sociology group at Cambridge. But there are other centers in Britain too, you know, yes. So there's several places, and in De Montfort University, Nikki Hudson and Lorraine Culley, and we have one of our authors here, Robin Hadley, who works on male fertility issues. So it's a dynamic series. And so I want to pose just one question briefly about that, and then you'll read your preface, and then we'll begin talking about your book.
Yeah.
But the big question is, you know, you were just a game changer. You were very ahead of your time, Soraya, you know, starting both the Oxford seminar series and the book series at the turn of the new millennium, when, you know, there was an anthropology of reproduction, but it wasn't really burgeoning yet. Why? What inspired you to do these two things?
Yes.
It's about 25 years ago at this point.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you, to Marian Berghahn, to Phil, to Marcia, who we have worked so closely together all these years. Very briefly, what first inspired me to look at reproduction in the way that it has now developed was back in the 1997, when the World Bank asked me to go to Iran to develop a strategy for mainstreaming gender. And that was a follow-up to the 1995 conference in Beijing, which was first introducing the idea. And therefore, the Iranian delegation who had been there asked the World Bank, and the World Bank, I was at the time the director of just had stepped down as the director of the gender studies in Oxford. So I went to Iran and I looked at the population, antinatalist populations policies of the Iranian government, which was in the middle of implementing their antinatalist policy, population policies, which has been so successful. Within 10 years, they managed to bring the population down to almost below the replacement level, from 3.9 growth per annum within 10 years. And they won the award for UNFPA, the UN's award for their success in population studies. So when I went to Iran, I was housed doing the consultancy work for the World Bank in the Bureau of Women's Affairs, where most of the staff there were very highly conservative women. And when I looked at the success of the population policies, I was talking for weeks, talking to these women. And they couldn't be of more conservative layers of society who were all staff in there. And they were talking to me about their children, how they have been educated at school into the value of having smaller size families as part of the campaign for the population policies. And the children, that generation was actually lecturing their parents, coming home, telling their parents not to have too many children. So you are not a battery hen, why are you having so many children? And that really amazed me, how in such a, by and large, conservative society, under a theocratic regime, this population policies have succeeded to this extent. And that really got me going, And then when I came back here, because I could see the contradictions within the Iranian society. We are having this generation of highly conservative people, and yet their children going to the other extreme. I got interested in the issue, and also looking around. At the time, China was having their antinatalist populations. I had lived in Romania when under Ceausescu's regime, we had this pro-natalist policies, brutal coercive policies, which had failed. So all of these things got me interested in the issue of reproduction. That's how it started. And then at that time, David Parkin was the head of the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology. He had just arrived in Oxford. I just stepped down as the director of the gender studies because I felt I had reached a stage where I wanted the issue of gender to be embedded in my studies, not something per se to study. And then I talked to David Parkin, and it was really thanks to his enormous support that we managed to set up the Fertility and Reproduction Studies group and the seminars that followed. And then after that, few seminars, I approached Marian Berghan with one book, and I said, will you be interested in publishing this book? And Marian said, well, if you have 2 books, we can make a series of it with her usual flexibility and vision. And then there is this history. But Marian, I'm sorry to say we haven't had enough books on sex yet.
That's true. They're mostly on fertility and reproduction.
So that's really the background.
That is an interesting background. Do you want to now read the paragraphs, or do you want to me to pitch in?
Well, I think a couple of paragraphs, actually not very long. I'm sorry to be reading, I know it's very boring.
The beautiful book with an Iranian goddess.
Goddess of fertility. I think it's just puts it in a context of what we want to perhaps talk about. It's a preface, really. And I started the book by putting a quote from Edward Herriot, French statesman, 1872 to 1957. It says, culture is what remains after one has forgotten everything else. So what I've said here is, this book is written for those generally believing that the Iranian culture is disappearing under the impact of social transformation. It argues that changes in social behavior and attitudes do not equal the weakening or disappearance of the core cultural values that underpin society. Instead, the book maintains that the strength of these values lie in their adaptability and in the way they interact selectively with innovation. It provides evidence by studying those social institutions that surround reproduction, such as marriage, family, kinship, patriarchy, fertility, and population fluctuation. This book is not about whether modernity and tradition clash, but rather how they work together to fit the agendas of the recipients. Soraya Shahshahani's study, Wedding Ceremony in Turmoil, which was published in the Journal of Anthropology of Middle East, which is also published by Berkhan Books. She encapsulates the ways in which the institution of marriage in Iran has adapted to modernity. According to Sohail Shahshahani, the core of marriage ritual has been preserved, although sequences have been changed to fit the working agendas of the bride and the groom. By implication, therefore, I take a different approach to the study of change by exploring what has not changed. Most of the chapters in this volume, in this book, have been published in other books and journals since 2006, and their selection is meant to show the depth and extent of the process of change over time. I have carried out research for more than 4 decades in Iran. I have the advantage of being simultaneously both an insider and outsider to Iran. After being born and spending my early adult life in Iran, I grew up to naturally know my own culture. At the same time, as an anthropologist, having spent most of my adult life outside Iran, I'm able to adopt an objective outsider's approach by making explicit the factors that are intrinsic to everyday life and thus invisible to those living among them. So I'm fortunate enough to have spent several years living among and studying different cultures across the globe. Long exposures to such varied, if not contrasting cultures, such as those of Nigeria, Romania, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and the United Kingdom, led me to question profoundly some of my own prejudices and value judgments. This has meant revisiting assumptions about my own culture, viewing them with fresh eye. I believe that the anthropological research technique of participant observation is a powerful adjunct to quantitative surveys, which have become the norm for so many studies on Iran, and which often, as articulated by an old Iranian saying, you take the people to the spring, but you bring them back thirsty. My findings neither endorse nor reject the practices described, such as child marriage, but merely reveal the underlying motivations behind their persistence. I'm aware that this book may provoke varied responses from those who are patient enough to read it, ranging from those who disagree strongly, providing counter-arguments and correctives, such as, you don't live here, you don't understand, to those who shrug their shoulders by implying that this book states the obvious, to those who think that I am missing the full picture. Some may also point out that I have neglected to explore the role of Iran's theocratic regime in perpetuating these practices. While this assertion may be partially true, this is not this book's objective. However, as always, I remain open to critique and prepared to learn from alternative perspectives. But I also just want to add one sentence, and that is that if you look at history and across the globe today, you find that authoritarian regimes could destroy a country through brutality, through fanaticism, through incompetence, through corruption. They can destroy the country, but they cannot destroy the culture. I mean, when you look, for example, at the Mongol invasion of Iran, of the Arab invasion of Iran, in the end, all the conquerors adopted the culture of the country rather than conquering it. So that's where I stop.
Well, with that, I mean, that's an excellent introduction to the core themes. And I think I'll start with a question about the core argument in the book, which is really, you're arguing that there are these deep-seated cultural values in Iran, surrounding marriage, the family, kinship, fertility, and that they're persistent despite the fact that there's been profound social transformation in a country with an authoritarian theocratic regime, since 1979, the year of the Iranian Revolution. And so, I'd like to ask you, why do you argue that Iranian culture is not changing as much as we might expect, that core cultural values are not disappearing, which is straight out of your preface, even though you use the terms that, these values are adaptable, they're interacting significantly with innovation, but by focusing on the fact that so much in Iran is non-changing, are you attempting to challenge other contemporary scholars of Iran who are arguing differently? That the society has been, topsy-turvy, overthrown in some way.
Yes. Well, no, I'm really not questioning the value
Scholars.
of the work of other scholars. But what I'm really saying is that most of these studies, which could be psychology, social sciences, to a lesser extent sociology, or some demography, their perspective is a restricted one. They just focus on their own topic. Whereas as anthropologists, we are using the methods of actually joining the dots, looking at the links between these institutions which are not immediately visible to people or to more restricted topics of studies, making them visible. Because as I said, people who live in the country or study one particular subject, anthropology has got a holistic approach. We have got a method of participant observation. We live among people and we look at these invisible features. And I wanted to bring in an additional dimension to all of these studies which have their own merits. So I am not denying them, but I just think when we talk about change, for example, people talk about how marriages are happen in Iran, from changing from forced marriage to arranged marriage. People meet online these days in Iran, or they meet at the university, which is their own choices. But then when it comes to the marriage negotiation, so many times these marriages fall apart because the families don't agree on the marriage negotiation. So how free is that such a choice? Or with the rate of divorce going up, sometimes within less than a year of marriage, divorce happens. So is that something which is real change? Or why is the divorce happening under the social pressure? These are the sort of subtleties which those more restricted studies are sort of not missing, but not addressing.
Absolutely. And, as anthropologists, I have to say, one of the things that I love about being an anthropologist is what you love about being an anthropologist is doing the field work, spending time with people over long periods of time in the place that we work. And so you've been working on Iranian issues for a very long time, more than 4 decades. Could you just talk a little bit about some of maybe the interesting moments of field work, or, the kinds of field work that then made their way into this particular book?
Well, yes, my interest in reproduction and family and family, kinship, marriage, they are all social expressions of reproduction.
Right.
Apart from the fact that my generation, my parents were brought up within extended families, almost everybody is brought up within extended families. Therefore, family relationships and kinship was a constant topic of conversation. One was exposed, being brought up to that. But my own PhD thesis, which I wrote, was about looking at the changes in the social structure and family relationships in 2 Iranian villages. In the 1960s, when under the Shah, the last Shah of the Pahlavi regime, the White Revolution was introduced, which was bringing a number of reforms. And one of the most important parts of that reform was the land reform, which actually deeply affected the social structure of the villages. And we were mainly rural society at that time. And therefore, I took 2 villages and compared the 2 villages, one which had undergone this land reform, which had distributed land and smaller size families, the landlord, which was a semi-feudal system, had disappeared, with some villages which had not gone under, and looked at the social. So that was, I mean, I've always been interested in the social structure of the family and reproduction and what changes had happened through increase in urbanization.
And she did her PhD at the Sorbonne, by the way.
That dates me, so many years ago. Anyway, but it wasn't really, since the revolution in 1970, Islamic revolution of 1997, that this 1979, sorry,
yes.
yeah, 1979, that my interest was renewed because one of the main targets of the Islamic regime revolution was to take the society back to its traditional core values, and family and kinship and reproduction was one of the main targets. They dropped the age of marriage, they reintroduced and encouraged, polygyny, all sorts of things. And interestingly, although this was one of the main focus of the revolution, the reproduction and those institutions attached to it were the ones which have gone more transformation than any other institution in society. The age of marriage has gone up, the female education, of course, but the female education is a different story. Actually, that went up under the revolutionary regime. The right of delay in the age of marriage, smaller sized family, all of these things that happened was, very, very interesting. The other thing was, of course, that a lot of these changes were happening not only among the secular middle classes in society, but among the children of the revolutionary themselves. So that was another interesting thing about conservative, about that. And also, it was the actual, yes, the one thing I wanted to say is, Iranian culture is not a monolithic culture. There are so many varieties linguistically, ethnically, less religion, but also religion. And so they vary in a number of ways. But when I looked at them, and I look at the core reproductive values, Iranians share more or less the same values. So it's very interesting to see how they have survived. And so, so that you understand why I have used reproduction as a lens to look into transformations and change in the society.
What we fondly call the repro lens. The repro lens. Reproduction is an incredible way to look at so many other aspects of social life and cultural life. I think all of us who work in this area, find that to be true in our field work as well. Okay, well, I'm going to actually talk about some of the big themes of the book. I want to say that there are 4 big issues taken up in your book. The first would be reproductive politics and population control by the Iranian state, which you've begun to talk about. Second, kinship, marriage, and family life, which you've also mentioned. Third, the emergence of assisted reproductive technologies to overcome infertility and to conceive children. And then fourth, religion, particularly the role of Shia Islam in decisions about IVF family making. And so just to move through, each of these topics briefly with 1 or 2 questions. To begin with reproductive politics, that you have such an interesting subtitle to your book. It's a question: to reproduce or not to reproduce? And what is the role of the Iranian state, over time in relation to reproduction, what we might call the population politics of the Iranian state? And in your book, you really show that before the Iranian Revolution of '79, the Iranian state has been very interested in reproduction and the reproductive health of its citizenry. So let's just talk a little bit about the sort of ups and downs of the Iranian state and population politics, which are captured in your book.
Yes, well, how long have you got?
Well, we're going to try to keep this pithy, because we'd like to have a discussion. But,
yes, absolutely. Well, the short answer is that the interest of the state in its population in Iran started almost 150 years ago under the Qajar dynasty, which was before the last dynasty, Pahlavi, where the population was seriously depleting and the health of the population was really, really bad. And Firuze Koshani Sovet, our colleague, has written extensively about this.
Yes.
And at that time, the state started taking an interest in the middle of the 19th century in the health of population, especially targeting mothers and the health of mothers, who they saw as, you know, the nation. I mean, if the health of the mothers is improved, so it was linked to the strength of the nation and health of the nation. They didn't really actually formulate a coherent policy about it, but it was an approach, what I call an approach to improving the health of the population, which continued until the mid-1950s under the Pahlavi dynasty, which came to power in 1927. And at that time, the population started growing, and by the mid-1960s, the population growth was almost 3.9. So in the 1960s, Iran took part in the Bucharest Conference in 1974, International Population Conference, and to actually slow down population growth. And they developed some antinatalist policies, which were more or less successful, but they were top-down and mainly targeting the urban population. It wasn't really until the revolution, Islamic revolution, that we can really talk meaningfully about population policies. When the Islamic revolution happened, the antinatalist policies of the previous government were dismantled, and Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the founder of the Islamic Republic, Islamic State, he encouraged people to have more children. And by the early 1980s, when the census showed that the population it was an explosion of population, again at 3.9 per annum growth. And the planners and health planners and policymakers realized the danger of such a huge explosion. So again, antinatalist policies were introduced, which I talked about, which had been so successful. It was an enormously well coordinated policy with the help from UNFPA, United Nations Fund for Population. And I remember talking to some of the implementers and planners of this policy, he said to me, look, every morning I was in the car at 5 o'clock in the morning driving to Qom, which is the seminaries based there, talking to the Ayatollahs about the danger of such a population growth. So the policymakers realize that unless they have the support of the leading religious jurists, senior jurists, they are not going to convince it, by and large, conservative population to have smaller size families. Yeah. And so it was with the support and active contribution and approval of the religious leaders, combined with a very well coordinated, the population, antinatalist population succeeded to the point that when the census of 2011 came out, it showed that the population was dropping below the replacement level. And at the moment, the population growth stands at 0.7, which is well below the replacement level.
Ultra low fertility.
So from 2011, first under Ahmadinejad's government, and now, of course, the ultra-conservative Raisi presidency, pronatalist policies have been reintroduced. So within 40 years, we have had 3 different policies, each one contradicting the other one. None of the ones in the past had been coercive, whereas the current population policies are very coercive, brutal. They even say they have banned even the prenatal scanning to detect genetic defects or anything, because they say we want to increase population at all costs, even having defective children genetically. And since 2011, the population policies have tried by carrot and stick policies to increase population, and so far they have not succeeded.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's an amazing history, and she has a wonderful chapter coming out in a book that Sarah Franklin and I are co-editing, really about looking at Iran's population shifting regimes fertility regimes and the current generation's rebellion, because nobody likes to be coerced in the ways that they reproduce,
Yes.
right? So it's very interesting. It's an interesting story. Well, moving to the second topic of the Iranian family, you examine the persistence of patriarchy in Iran, which we could say persists all over the world, but especially in Iran, the importance of something called face and saving face. And one of the things I love about your work is that you do focus on men, the role of men in reproduction and family life. And so can you talk a little bit about, the father, the Iranian father in today's world? Could we argue that they're losing face due to, living in a regime that is authoritarian, there are economic woes in Iran, and rebellious offspring? Talk a little bit about the men in this story.
Yeah. Well, actually, as you know, a chapter that one of them was published in one of the books you have edited, I've talked about fatherhood in Iran.
Yeah.
Yes, and also the importance of face or aberu, which, losing face, while in some cultures it is important, in Iran has been traditionally, historically, absolutely crucial to individuals' personhood. If I may, it's very interesting about aberu or face, which I wrote about how it's important. I would like to read a few lines here from in New York Times in 2003, published an article to do with the nuclear program of the Iranian government, to do with faith. It said, if there are any two words in Persian that President Obama should learn, they are maslahat and aberu. Maslahat is often translated as expediency or self-interest. Aberu means face, as in saving face. In the nearly 34 years since the Islamic Revolution in Iran, expediency has been a pillar of decision-making, but within a framework that has allowed Iranian leaders to save face. If there is to be any resolution of the nuclear standoff, Western leaders must grasp these concepts. And it goes on. I mean, there are many, many articles written about it, thousands of years of importance of faith. So within that, if you're talking about fatherhood and patriarchy, as I said, I mean, Iranian culture is very varied. Everything I say, somebody else can get up and prove that the opposite is also true. But I find that fatherhood and patriarchy in Iran has had to adjust to change. Therefore, fathers also, some of them genuinely are not our images of patriarchy. And of course, as you know, Suad Joseph has written extensively about how fathers can be very loving within a patriarchal system. Women within that system are cooperating with men. It's not just a male thing, it's a system at work. But fathers, I divided them into four groups, as you know. There are fathers who are modern and they realize they cannot, through coercion or violence, control their family. Basically, fatherhood is about maintaining control of your household and your family. And many of them have resorted to kindness, to financially bribing their children, buying places near their own house for them, to have them, keeping in direct control. Other fathers have resorted to learning to work with new technologies. They creep in the middle of the night to open their children's or their wives' computers to see what is going on. That's one group of fathers. Other fathers who actually object and can't adjust to their children gaining their freedom have withdrawn. They just sort of, they live a sad life because their children. I have examples from within my own large network of cousins who had migrated to, for example, Canada, to the Western countries, but they still can't tolerate their daughters to go to a university in a different town. I mean, if it's a boy, it's okay, but the girl can't go there. And they have been rejected by their wives and daughter. And then, of course, we also have fathers who find solutions, resourceful fathers. For example, I know of Iranians whose children have been to school, they don't obey them anymore. They have had to go to Dubai, for example, and open their business in Dubai to take their children away from that conditions to be able to control them. And then the group of fathers who are violent, So, it all takes different forms. but it all still boils down to fathers trying to remain in control.
And save face and not lose face in the society.
Yes, I mean, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, in a nutshell, I'm sorry.
That was an excellent description of, I mean, it's really important to talk about men in reproduction and family life. We far too often ignore the important role of men in this broad field. Marriage is also deeply important, and you argue in your book that there really are still these deep-seated cultural values regarding marriage, and there is the persistence of early marriage, cousin marriage, which is quite common throughout the Muslim world, consanguineous marriage, and temporary marriages, which are a uniquely Shia form of marriage, not allowed in Sunni Islam. You identify this emerging marriage practice among younger generation Iranians called white marriage, which I'd like you to say a few words about. And as you mentioned in your introduction, there is an increasing divorce rate, including among the older generation of Iranians, men and women who can't stand each other anymore. And so say a few words about the state of marriage in modern, Iran today. Are marital values persisting, or are they adapting to new social realities?
Both. Really. First of all, the age of the rate of female literacy is very high in Iran, and there are more girls at universities than there are boys.
Across the Middle Eastern world, I must say.
Everywhere. The gender relations have taken very interesting twists and turns. I mean, we know we have girls at universities in Iran now who have boyfriends who are younger than themselves, who are jobless. She says, I don't care, I just want to experiment as free sexual life, for example, In that sense, or you have seen under this Mahsa Amini, which happened last year, the girl who was killed, more men had gone out in the streets actually supporting women. How many of those men will go home and still behave in the same way? I can't tell you, but we don't know. That's why you need the anthropological studies. But on the whole, female literacy went up under the revolutionary regime because sex segregation was imposed. And people from rural areas were very happy then to send their daughters to schools which were not mixed education. And the whole idea was to actually have educated, good Muslim women, which of course backfired. Because once these girls were educated, the age of marriage went up. There is a delay in the age of marriage, and a delay in the childbearing age. And the rate of divorce, according to the latest 2022 statistics, which I looked at, is much higher in Tehran, which is the capital, and some northern provinces like Mazandaran and Gilan. Is lower in some southeast of Iran, Baluchistan, Kerman, those areas. But the average rate of divorce now is 28% in Iran. So
which is quite high for Muslim society.
It is quite, and some of them happen within less than a year of being married. The size of the family has got much smaller. And so therefore we have got, this is kind of marriage, as you said. The early marriages, or they call child marriage, which I have studied specifically, has gone up. Of course, you can say that is under economic hardship. Also, people don't want their children to have the freedom of modernity and go out and be free. So a lot of them who have more control of their children have them married off. But a considerable number of this happen with the agreement. And it is customary, it is nothing to do with these other factors in addition. And this has gone up. The cousin marriage, consanguineous marriages have also gone up because the rate of divorce being so high, although the consanguineous marriages had been fewer and fewer, now people prefer to marry who they know among themselves. The white marriage is a form of cohabitation, which is actually forbidden under the Islamic regime because it's formed like adultery because you're not married officially. And many of these could use the form of saying, well, we are temporarily married, therefore give it legitimacy, but they don't. They refuse to do it. Many of these white marriages among younger people is with the approval of the middle class secular crosses the approval. But a lot of them are also women who have been divorced, who enter into a relationship. However, a lot of studies show that at the end of the day, these, especially women, they want children, but they can't have children outside wedlock under the Islamic regime. There are also examples of this, and they call it white marriage, their marriages, which is not a real marriage. Some of them have left Iran, gone to the countries where they are allowed to have children without being married. Their number is increasing, but it is not considerable. It is a form of marriage. So that's another one. What else? Yes, I mean, one of our younger colleagues has studied thalassemia among thalassemia patients, and she found out that is a Hoyosa, Sachiko, in Japan. She found out among the thalassemia patients, marriage is still very important. They prefer to get married knowing that they might have abortion, but marriage is still, very, very important for them. So as you have also found out in your studies in the Middle East, marriage is still a fundamental institution which is persisting in spite of all the changes that are happening.
Yes, it really is, and just the notion of out-of-wedlock births is just, beyond the pale. So the persistence of marriage and some new forms of marriage, as it were, and the notion of temporary marriage, which is this thing that Islam allows people to make an agreement for particular periods of time that they can say that they're married.
And it's completely legitimate under the Islamic regime, and people use that for all sorts of purposes.
Yeah. Well, going to the third issue in your book is about infertility in Iran and Iranian society, and the emergence of what we call assisted reproductive technologies. The platform technology, to use Sarah Franklin's term, the platform technology was IVF, which came out in the UK in 1978 with the first birth of Louise Brown, but then took off around the world, including in Iran and the rest of the Middle East. And Iran is really an interesting country. It has about 70 IVF centers across the country, which places it second only to Turkey in terms of the number of IVF clinics in the Middle Eastern region. And it's also impressive that there's a private IVF, market in Iran, but the government actually provides IVF in some government clinics, so is interested about the problem of infertility among Iranian couples. So can you talk a little bit about the emergence of IVF in Iran? And really it's a burgeoning, high-tech sector. And one thing that I have to say about Iran and most of the Middle East is that there is what we might call high-tech biomedicine in Iran. Iran is a very techno-scientifically agentive country, really putting money into science, to nuclear science, stem cell science, and we don't give enough attention to that. But your book really does. It talks about, how ARTs have become a very important sector of Iranian society. So could you say a few words about that?
Well, I'm actually, after that conference in Tehran that both you and I went to, you wrote about that conference was about assisted reproductive technologies.
Right.
You wrote about it. I wrote about it in the Journal of Royal Anthropological Institute, calling not all Muslims are Luddites, just to show that Iran is very closed society with one perspective and very open other one, and
very
how
high-tech.
How they have allowed from organ donation to assisted reproductive technologies, all have been legitimized in Iran.
And gender reassignment surgeries is one of the hubs of the world for people who are changing.
So how this all has happened is goes back today to the contribution of the religious leaders. I am not here talking about the political authorities, theocratic, but the jurists, senior Islamic jurists, who are Shia. And in the Shia school of Islam, this senior religious leaders, the senior jurists, who are called the sources of emulation, the mujtahids, when they are faced with new situations, they resort to the Quran, to the holy book, and come up with interpreting within the Quranic text answers to these new problems. And the edicts that they issue are called fatwas. I think everybody knows what a fatwa is. And all these technologies have been allowed and legitimized through issuing fatwas, including assisted reproductive technologies. When it first came to Iran, the practitioners who were introducing these technologies to Iran realized that this goes beyond the medical procedure, and it touches new reproductive technologies, touch on family, on kinship, on all
conceiving life,
right? Everything. Therefore, they sort of sought the help and approval of the religious leaders. And of course, the religious leaders in Shia school of Islam, they have different opinions. They don't always agree with each other. Some even contradict each other. But their views are equally valid. One doesn't rule out the other one. And therefore, they each have got their own followers. And although the sources of emulation were divided about the use of reproductive technologies, some disagreed and some agreed, the practitioners followed those who approved of it. And therefore that is how it was legitimized. On transgender, it was Ayatollah Khomeini himself, because they went to him, the doctors, and sort of said, look, this is a medical condition, it's not pervert, and he allowed it. So
there's a wonderful book on that by Afsan and Najma Badi called Professing Selves, about trans activism in Iran that made this happen.
So all of these technologies, but when it came to third-party donation, assisted reproduction, you have written extensively about that among the Sunni. The Sunni speak with one voice, and they ruled out completely any form of third-party donation, because that was an intrusion into marriage and it was a form of adultery.
Yeah, that would include, just to be clear, egg donation, sperm donation, embryo donation, and surrogacy. Shia allow, Sunnis do not.
Shia have allowed all of this, resorting to fatwas by those who approve of it. Of course, there are so many of these sources of emulation who completely reject it. And they have even redefined lineage. You know, it has become a contract between the donor of a gamete and the recipient, that they sign a contract, and even then, so but the way all of this has been legitimized has left a lot of gaps and loopholes, which as they come across them, I mean, the practitioners are actually in despair, and they wanted to, before Raisi came to be a president of the Conservative, the practitioners wanted to actually pass a law to make a sperm and egg donation anonymous, so people can actually go and sort of, without any follow-up of conflicts between the donors and recipients of gamete, so all of that be sorted out. Of course, that has been put on shelf since. But on the other hand, population policies, which are pronatalist at the moment, they are encouraging of births. The number of clinics, infertility clinics, have gone up to 100 because the government has actually invested in infertility clinics. They want to. They are even encouraging people who have got children to go to infertility clinics to have more children. Anyway, we won't go into that because it's too long. But that is how, with the help from this mechanism available within the Shia school, which gives flexibility to actually accommodating change, that all this has happened.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story, actually, I think, of Iran and in this realm. And it is an example now of one of many societies coping with ultra low fertility, very low fertility rates, where IVF is being invoked as a way to bring population up. And, you know, all through East Asia, Japan, you know, different countries that are having fertility problems are turning to IVF again, and it's really an interesting story.
It is, but I find it's a little bit sort of dreaming and wishful thinking, because the rate of success of IVF, maximum 30% among younger population, and as the age of marriage has been delayed, the likelihood of the contribution of, say, infertile people to increasing population is very unlikely, because Okay, people go for IVF, have one child, maximum 2 children. Are they going for a third one with the online? And you need to have more than 2 children to actually contribute to increasing population. So how realistic this is, I don't know. I have my doubts about Iran anyway.
Yeah, the future will tell. The future will tell.
okay.
You know, what's going to happen in a number of different countries where the country is really pushing IVF. I mean, it's an interesting story. You started talking about this, but I do want to ask. I have just 2 more questions, and one of them is about what you called in an article titled "The Downside to Gamete Donation." That, you know, not everything is great when you start getting sort of free access to sperm donation, egg donation, embryo donation, and surrogacy. And there are dangers, potential dangers that you pointed out. Could you talk a little bit about them? We published an article together talking about the bioethical aftermath of doing IVF, and particularly in the ways that are happening in Iran. For example, talk a little bit about intrafamilial donation and some of the problems with that.
Yes. Well, I think, as I say, those core fundamental values to do with kinship and family relationships is still very much there. In the early days of gamete donation, third-party egg and sperm donation, these technologies were not very well known in Iran. And people would bring their relatives. A sister would bring her sister and receive an egg. And it's not just Iran, as you know, elsewhere this has happened as well. Men would bring their brothers, or even in some cases their father, to receive sperm from them. I published that in another chapter about a man who talked to the doctor. He was infertile, he received his brother's sperm, but they didn't tell his wife. And the wife was under the impression that this was her own husband's sperm. I mean, there are so many ethical and legal aspects involved in all of that. But gradually, as these technologies have become better known, people are resorting now, if they can, to the anonymous donors. And then they claim this is their own biological child. Because lineage is very important, blood relatives, and being linked by blood is very important. A child who is not biologically related to you is never really accepted in the family. That is why adoption is such a problem in Iran. And adopted children don't inherit according to the law, except if you make a special wish and contract, they don't.
And that's true in Sunni Islam as well.
Sunni Islam as well. So that was, and I have published again in one of the books, as Islam and Assisted Reproductive Technologies, which we edited together, about some examples of how, in case of third-party donation, women have ended up having to become refugees in this country, because I acted as expert to escort Iranian expert report for these women refugees who had to take refuge as a result of having undergone a third-party IVF treatment, and their men didn't accept children. In one case, as you know, they had come here some years ago to England and had undergone third-party IVF, what they thought was IVF treatment, and when the children were born triplets, they were blonde with blue eyes. And the parents were both, and there was no care. So it was obvious that actually
A donor
had, but the man hadn't revealed that. But when the children were born like that, the man completely lost face. It's a question of loss of face again. And he objected his wife and children to horrendous treatment and said that she had slept with the doctors in the clinic. And what is more, the woman's father and brothers also sided with the husband. So these are the cases. And another woman entered a temporary marriage with a married man, had a child to secure her relationship with the man. And in the end, the man denied her any access to the child, and she again had. I mean, there are examples, and there are many, but we don't know. And also,
there's the problem with incest too, intrafamilial incest, if you're taking all of your gametes from within your family.
Exactly, and also.
Well, or you don't know where they come from. It is within a limited community.
Yes.
Israel has had a lot of problems with this.
Yes. Anytime you're in a closed community and there's donation going on, you may end up with half-sibling incest. And in fact, there are cases where brothers and sisters' sperm are being used.
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. I mean, the form of kinship, that completely changes the form of kinship, that you are somebody's child was also half brother to the child, and I mean this whole new network.
Or both a child and a
There's a
grandchild.
chapter in this book about it. But there's another example which Dr. Okhundi and Dr. Behjati, I think they may be here actually, gave me the example of one sister had given an egg to her sister, and there was a child who was 5 years old, and when the child was 5 years old, this donor sister's own child died in a car accident. So she came and claimed the child they'd given. And they ended up in court, and the court gave the child back to her biological mother because of the way that the fatwas had legitimized donation, had said the child belongs biologically to his donor parent and only inherits from social, the name from the social. So as I said, there are so many loopholes and legal aspects that are not actually resolved at all. So, I mean, I'll stop here, but I can go on giving you examples.
Yeah, there's so many examples.
Of the downsides.
Isn't it wonderful how modernization simplifies tradition?
Really? Well, I have to say, this is why the Sunni regime is much stricter. They're like, we don't want incest, we don't want marital difficulties, we don't want to have children who do not know their lineage, we don't want to have strangers entering the family. They're very strict about it. And it's, to me, amazing, because over 40 plus years now of IVF, that has not changed in the Sunni world, at least, you know, officially. Although we're beginning to see a few articles being published about clandestine underground gamete donation going on in the Arab countries, but it's, you know, it's just not accepted. Whereas in Iran, so what we see is Sunni Muslims traveling to Shia places like Iran and parts of Lebanon to do their gamete donation in secrecy. I wrote about that for Lebanon. And so I just have to say, at lunch we were talking about Soraya. When I was first in Lebanon, I did most of my research in Egypt, which is ardently Sunni and has a small Coptic Orthodox Christian population. But, you know, I was working on these issues in the Sunni Muslim world. And then I went to Lebanon, which is the most religiously diverse country in the Middle East. There are 18 different religious communities in Lebanon, and doing a lot of work on Shia, you know, IVF, and not understanding what was going on with those Shia in Lebanon. And so this lovely woman said, I contacted her. This is before we really knew each other as well as we do now. Can you explain what's this temporary marriage thing going on? Because in the IVF clinics, you can bring in a donor, the man can temporarily marry her for 48 hours while they make the embryo, and then divorce. It was all done within marriage, you know. So anyway, so I explained a lot of that to me, but the Sunni world has just decided none of this because it's way too confusing for all the things that they care about. Well, ultimately, the final question is, you read in your preface, and I'm going to reiterate one of your statements, I have neglected to explore the role of Iran's theocratic regime in perpetuating these practices. And I want to say, not so really, because the book is full of, you know, issues of religion and the role of this theocracy in Iran. I mean, Iran is a country in the world that has a theocratic, authoritarian regime still in place, still very powerful. You know, anything you'd like to say about that, you know, the theocracy of Iran today in the realm of reproduction, and if it has anything to do with the title of your book, which is a great title. It's what? Inconceivable Iran.
Well, that's thanks to you.
Well, I have to say great title that I helped with, okay. But, you know, talking about contemporary Iran and its politics and its ruling fertility regime, and, you know, how things are now and how it might play out, just any speculation.
Well, I said some people might say I have neglected.
That's true. But I say you haven't. So
the thing is, I mean, it depends how you define politics. You know, politics as per involvement with the regime, or politics as you live your life on daily life. You know, I have wanted to look at the daily life of people that sometimes, in spite of the politics, how they carry on, find solutions in the face of authoritarian regime, which has now become brutal and coercive. I mean, the coercion of the pronatalist policies of Iranian regime at the moment is unbelievable. It almost goes beyond Ceausescu's regime, you know, how they, and they are failing because it doesn't suit people. When policies don't suit people, they find ways around it, and they also And at the moment, what I'm really saying at the end of the day is the Iranian regime and authorities on the at that political level got involved in the population once in cooperating with the anti-natalist policies with their support. It was successful. And the IVF technologies, they supported them. Now they are using, the increasing population has become the top of the agenda. It becomes a sort of panic. But of course, it's not just Iran. I mean, the population is declining everywhere in the world.
Yes.
But
and marriages too.
And marriages too. I mean, it's very similar trends, you know. But what is about this current population policies of the state's involvement at political level is that while in the past 150 years, none of the population policies have been coercive, and they have taken into consideration the health of the population. This present regime is ignoring the health of the population, is coercive to the extreme, and has not succeeded so far.
And she calls that reproductive rebellion. Younger generation Iranians just putting their foot down and saying, I'm not going to do this. Yeah.
And I actually think people don't say we don't want children. The reproductive values haven't changed. People want to have the children on their own terms, as many as they like and when they like it, not when the state tells them to. So I think that is not a game that the regime can win easily. I hope not.
There you go. Well, those are the questions that I wanted to talk about. They cover a lot of the material in this book, some of the big themes. And now I think we should open it to the audience. You might have questions. And Phil, you can share, there are online questions perhaps coming in.
Well, thus far I don't see any online ones, but Haneen was going to manage that for me.
There is a comment and a question in the Q&A.
Are they further down the page then than what I've got?
Do you want to sit here?
No, that's all right.
There are quite a few chat comments too.
Yeah, but we're looking for...
Sahela has
Sorry,
asked
you
a
just,
question.
that's been
you found
changed.
them.
Well, somebody changed it.
Great.
Okay.
What is she saying?
Well, this is from Sahera
This is
Shahani.
Shahani, my friend in Iran.
The rationality for having a child, for improving a family relationship. I remember you mentioned examples of difficulties which parents had after having such children, and you wondered, did this practice improve family lives? I think you've answered that.
Yes, I think I already have.
I think that was what you were just talking about.
But may I add just one thing? Under the when the cases of divorce happened, it was a question of the custody of the children, which traditionally a boy at the age of 2 went to his father, and the girl at the age of 7 was going back to the father, because you belong to your father's lineage and inherit from your father's lineage. But some years ago, this changed, and the children at the age of 11 are allowed to choose which parent they want to live with. I have examples within my own huge network of cousins, when the children first decided to go and live with their father, and after a few years they got tired and said, no, we want to live with our mother. So they moved on. So with the rate of divorce being as high as it is, and the children not being able to decide at such a young age, I mean, you can have a variety of situations. Whether that improves or is a cause of complete conflict, it all depends. I mean, there is no yes and no answer to that, right, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, I mean, the trial and error method seems to be what is operating to an extreme degree.
There was a follow-up question, just I noticed right here to this. Just from the audience right here, Phil.
Please.
Yeah.
Thank you, that's so interesting. It's not my area, it's really interesting. You won't remember many years ago, we had a discussion about DNA.
Yes.
And I thought that it should be made available as on birth.
Like paternity testing?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you say a bit more about that in Iran?
Iran doesn't have a national data, DNA data. This is the whole thing. Is we have had these discussions with so many of the practitioners. Can you follow, know who his donor is, and they can't.
And what about in families?
Or families, they don't
request
hide
Is it
it.
commercialised?
Maternity
Because that's what's
testing.
happened here.
Yeah.
It's been taken out of the discussion
Yeah, yeah.
20 years ago was should the NHS make it available at birth, but now it's taken out of everybody's hands and it's commercialised. What's happening?
Well, in Iran, it's also commercialized because, you know, although they say donation should be a gift, basically, the donors who were not members of the family, they were outsiders. The doctors in the clinics built up the cost of travel and accommodation, basically the cost of donation into that. But surrogacy, I mean, it's a huge amount of money involved. And Mansour, you have worked on these things very much. It is, you know, you have to pay for the expenses of 9 months of looking after the surrogate mother. It's huge expenses, but that is more acceptable. But it's all built up as costs more than actually the cost of donation.
The state doesn't, because it's out. The state here has lost. Many countries have lost control of the situation.
Yes, there's no enforcement policy. I mean, in theory there is, but not in practice.
I will say, in following up, in the United States, you know, commercial DNA testing like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, where you can just buy a $150 test and find out who you are, where you're from. I mean, a lot of information comes out of that testing. It's just turning up so many what are being called DNA surprises. People who did not know that the social father was actually not their biological father, or that their mother had an affair. I mean, it's causing a lot of disruption now in American society, and it's a very interesting problem. And if that becomes available widely in Iran, you can imagine what kids are going to find out, you know. I mean, it's good. I mean, if it does, and is it available, those kinds of test home, do-it-yourself genetic testing?
No.
No.
And the doctors bury the information so deep.
Yeah.
It's so difficult to actually find out. But I must say that we once had a lecture from the director of the public health in Oxford. It wasn't in case of IVF donation or anything, but he said, you know, it's not just him, it has been available in the news as well, that in the country, in the UK, 1 out of 4 or 5 children are not the biological children of their fathers, without the father knowing that.
60, was it not in the 70s? On an army base, it was 60%. And 40% of general population. And now people are much more mobile, and values and mores have changed.
Yeah.
So,
no, I mean, it's very difficult. But as I said, because anonymous donation has been happening, you know, the information is not there. It's impossible to, even if they found out, but how are they going to find out?
Go and trace the
when you claim my child,
And it's worth pointing out that, I mean, the extent of cross-cousin marriage, consanguineous marriage, across the Mediterranean, the Middle East into Pakistan, of course, is very, very high.
Yes.
All of these questions arise in that, you know, in a sense. Should two families that, in a sense, have been creating daughters or sons for some time, and if a genetic problem occurs in consequence of one of the marriages, should they tell anybody? Should one family expect, you know, all the members of that family to have a genetic test before they agree to marry them, and so forth? So the whole thing expands tremendously among forms of marriage, which are in fact precisely the ones, as you were pointing out, that people aim at actually to secure the right sort of people, and also property and a lot of other things to get into it.
Yes.
So it's a very dense phenomenon. Please.
A quick question. First of all, on this discussion, I couldn't help but recall that this is the theme in all soap operas. The father, the paternity isn't the father isn't. No, but my question is this: so, as the state is interested in ensuring and facilitating reproduction, are there policies to restrict, contraception and abortion? And what's the story with that?
Oh yes, all of that has been banned. Banned. Abortion has been banned completely. Prenatal scanning is now stopped. However, I mean, the latest statistics tell us there are 250,000 abortions illegal, of course, and they're all within the married couples doing it. It's not because the pregnancy has happened outside the wedlock, because all these contraceptive measures have been stopped now under the pro-natalist policy. It is brutally coercive.
And is there no underground contraceptive network?
Yes, of course there is.
Then what, can you talk about that a little bit more in detail? Like how do they get access to, how do people get access to whatever, I don't know what contraceptives they're able to get?
The drugs are smuggled, people go out to Dubai and buy things and bring them back. Pharmacists, they're all sort of ways of, and of course a lot of them are not good drugs, they have got side effects sometimes, it's not trustworthy sort of drugs. Abortion is not allowed under any circumstances, as I said, or it's all sort of
Even if the mother's life is...
No, it isn't. Yes, that was before, but now under this pro-natalist policies, yes, it's.
We have some questions here which are related to this, and which two in particular from Tamara Dragadze, which have to do with what really, she says, I would like to know how population limitation policy is enacted in practice. Contraception, coitus abortion, coitus interruptus, or abortion.
All
and of course,
that.
you said they're all.
No, coitus interruptus, you can't control.
You can. But it's also kind of marginally effective. And her other question has to do with when abortion is approved, and obviously it isn't. So
no, it isn't approved at all, no.
But I hope.
Cost to mothers' lives and babies' lives and disabled children being born.
Anyway, I hope tomorrow that answers your question.
Tomorrow I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah.
I do have to say, can I just say that across the Middle East, abortion is criminalized, but Islam, this is around, but Islam in general has been what we would call permissive toward abortion, because the beginning of life the ensoulment, which is sort of, it's not like Catholicism where conception starts at the day one moment of conception. It's when ensoulment happens, which is anywhere between 40 and 120 days of gestation.
Yes.
So, in the religion, theoretically, abortion should be allowed, but there have been laws, often colonial laws across the region, that prohibit it. But usually they allow abortion when the mother's life is at risk, and sometimes in cases of rape, but this is really, really restrictive.
It varies a lot within Iran, because of course the world's most populous Islamic country, sorry, I said Iran, I meant Islam, is Indonesia, and abortion is legal in Indonesia. Although local imams of the modern sort, which is to say the ones that are more like the traditional ones in the Middle East, because Indonesian Islam is very open about women inheriting property, being able to divorce. I mean, Indonesia is one of the few parts of the world in which divorce is actually on the rise. On the decline, because women, in a sense, having had an arranged marriage, had every right to say, no, I'm not going to go through it. And that counted as a divorce. But anyway, you can get an abortion if you're a Muslim in Iran, in Indonesia, and that's not a problem. We have a question.
It's from Sarah Bamdad.
Yes. What do you think about the role of sanctions? And I think what she means are the international sanctions in the development of IVF in Iran and the regime's neonatal policies by resorting to IVF. Are the sanctions relevant?
The international sanctions against Iran.
Economic and political and so forth.
I don't think so. I mean, yes, Mansour, you are very...
Officially, no, but because some basic material is not available, it might indirectly impact on the IVF or assisted reproductive technology.
Yes, that's actually a worrying thing, isn't it?
Yes, I don't know the answer to that. Yes, thank you very much. Yes.
Can I ask? So, in coming back to faith, and not permission abortion for disabled children, how is that? How does that happen? You have disabled. What is the view within the family, particularly paternalistic, having disabled children? Obviously, in Islam and generally accepted, they have their own place, but in terms of the family and kinship, and how is that viewed?
Well, I think it depends on your background, your social background, how conservative you are, how religious you are. whether you're a secular family, educated or not. I mean, education and conservatism don't contradict each other. You find a lot of educated but highly conservative people. So, as I said, that Sachiko Hoyosa's study of thalassemia shows that family and children, they want to get married, although they know they may have disabled children. They may resort to abortion or may not, but they don't mind it because family and marriage is important. But a lot of, that's why the rate of abortion, the level of abortion is so high in Iran at the moment, because especially people, if they know they are going to have disabled children. So it varies, there isn't a one answer to all of that. It depends on the social family within which that happens.
Yes, yeah. On that theme, polygamy, how common is that? Because places I've worked, and with my constituents in the UK, this happens, where the woman will know, she'll repeatedly have disabled children. She knows it's because it's her first cousin, but she doesn't want to be replaced. And that doesn't mean that, and I'm not sure what's worse, being divorced or being the sort of first wife, discarded first wife. How common is that?
I don't think polygamy is very rife, but temporary marriage is. A lot of men on the side have got what they call sireh, the temporary sort of wife, is a muta marriages, as it's called in Arabic. But I don't know, there isn't, having polygamy is not very, traditionally, of course, there was always this, and there was the older woman who became then, in control of the household, with the younger woman being always handpicked, and all that. But it doesn't happen all that often for various reasons, not least the economic conditions. And women themselves don't want necessarily to be the second wife to somebody, but women are very happy to be, in the temporary marriage arrangements.
Yeah, the rates are actually in the Arab world very low. I mean, one of the Western conceptions is that Muslim men marry 4 wives all the time, and that's just so wrong. It's really wrong. I mean, the rates are really low for all sorts of reasons.
Yes,
You're supposed to treat spouses equally, economically, it's not affordable.
No, I live with the Palestinians, and I know, and I've seen cases here in the UK where this has been happening, and the doctor is invited in to explain.
With consanguinity and stuff. Yeah, in the Arab world, like in the Arab world, they have the highest rates of autosomal recessive genetic disorders in the world, and issues of like prenatal testing or just marriage counseling, like should everybody be counseled? Because if you're going to marry your first cousin, there are these implications. So that's like it's an area that I think is beginning to really sort of be discussed. And
even traditionally, there were very few men who had 4 wives, except if you were a landlord or the king, or the royal family who could afford it, and you could have 4 wives, 4 official wives, and endless concubines. But I mean, traditionally, when it didn't happen.
I mean, these systems raise a lot of hackles in the West. But partly what we're talking about is, in fact, they have a kind of pliability and plasticity and manipulability that also solves problems. Now, the Indonesian case is one in which, again, Islamic society, very little polygyny, but some, looked down upon generally. But it's particularly common amongst the Minangkabau, who are the world's 2nd largest matrilineal population, about 7 million between Malaysia and Indonesia. And there, the second wife status is interpreted rather differently than what you're talking about. Okay, I am, let's say, the first wife, and I'm not producing any children, and my husband is going to say, well, get rid of you, or take a second wife. And the option is very much to take the second wife, assuming then the kind of everybody knows who it's going to be and who it's coming from. Because the first wife, who cannot have children, becomes an honorary mother of some of the children that that second wife has, and that status is very highly regarded. So in a sense, the problem is solved very, very humanely, it seems to me. So The more options you've got, it might be better, although I must admit the Persian one does seem to be to multiply the impossible options everywhere.
But can I also add that with education, women now have got traditionally the status of a woman dependent on motherhood. It was the highest estate. If you couldn't reproduce, you had no status in society. But with women sort of being educated, being able economically independent and all that, motherhood is one of their many identities. Women have got other identities other than motherhood. And therefore, very few women probably would want to be a second wife to somebody, and also demographically, it's probably impossible.
Well, demographically, the point, particularly where Africa is concerned, is in the sense, there you are, you're pregnant and then you're breastfeeding, and you're not supposed to have sex after you're breastfeeding. Poisons the milk. Who's your best friend? The other wife or wives, because of course the husband can have sex with them, and therefore there's no problem. So again, these options solve various problems.
But the problem is there are no yes and no answers to any of these things. It's such a complex issue that, as I say, there are multiple factors involved which determine any particular possibility. That is what makes it so interesting in reproduction. And I think, Marian, as long as the humans go on reproducing, I think this series will continue.
I also have to say, I think our conversation really pinpoints that Islam is not monolithic. There's a great deal of variety in Islamic regimes around the world, and we shouldn't be stereotyping as we tend to do in the West. And I also really just have to point out, I was not raised Catholic, and I don't mean to offend, but Catholicism is the most restrictive reproductive regime in the world. Doesn't allow condoms, birth control, abortion, assisted reproductive technologies. It really, and again, what do you see in Catholic countries? Massive resistance to that. There's an IVF industry booming in Latin America, Italy, France, Catholic countries, because people do not like to have their reproduction coerced, right? But religiously, Catholicism is the most restrictive regime in the world. And evangelical Christianity in America, too, is really very reproductively restrictive. But Islam, no, not really, not really. So I do really want to emphasize that.
Hanine, I'm not certain how long we should be going on with this.
Well, we still have 20 minutes to
Okay.
the full 2 hours. And also, there was a hand up earlier, and I'm not sure if you are seeing the hand online. It disappeared again.
I may not be down at the bottom of the
Ben
page.
Castan has written questions, but maybe he also wants to
Ben
speak.
Castan and there's somebody.
Ben, if you want to speak, put your hand back up.
It's somebody else before Ben as well up there.
Right now, there's no hand up there. Got more questions.
Okay, well, we can raise his question, though. The discussion drought themes of adolescence and shifting masculinities. It would be great to hear how inconceivable Iran might help us understand the woman life freedom demonstrations, where young women and men have been so central.
What was the question?
Well,
to talk about the demonstrations from last year, the woman life freedom demonstrations, and that men are also, you did mention that, but.
Yes, and also that those are purely political. It's not linked to reproduction at all. This is a lot of frustrations and protests which have been bubbling under the surface, and that was really the trigger. The death of Mahsa Amini was a trigger. As I said, there were more men in the streets than there were women, but how this is really actually affecting the gender relations, I don't know. We need to go and study that. There was somebody before Ben, I think, what also.
Yes, it was more of a comment, I think, but let me see.
That's him,
do you see the end of patriarchy across the globe, even in the distant future, especially on reproductive rights of women with advances in technology? That's from Ashok Kushner.
Oh, this is Ashok, yes. Hello, Ashok. He was in Oxford so many years ago.
Right.
So what the question is?
Well, the question is, do you see patriarchy ever ending, even in the distant future, particularly where it refers to reproductive rights of women and advances in technology?
Well, as I said, at the moment, the way I see it, Ashok, is that patriarchy has changed face has changed tactic to adjust to modernity. And modernity is often a social change rather than a cultural, deep, fundamental transformation. So for how long patriarchy can go on adjusting? Well, I think eventually, probably, patriarchy has weakened anyway in many places in the world. But I wouldn't say it has gone away. How long it will take, I don't know the answer to that. But I think probably it won't be quite so coercive as it has been. Basically because of the status of women changing.
I would like to agree.
Yeah.
What I will say, which is just intentionally provocative and doesn't have an answer, is as we look around the world today and see the march of authoritarian regimes, which are backed up by millions of thugs, I'm not certain I'm as confident as you are that the distant future is not, out of sight.
Yes.
But let us hope for that.
Who else is back?
Sarah Franklin has
But
a
not,
question.
but not uniquely led by men.
This is my son's
Let's not get into the discussion. I can name you a lot of female leaders who are every bit as authoritative and violent as the men. Gender in some ways is not relevant. Sarah.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much, Soraya, for your book, and all of you for such an amazing series, and Marianne as well for presiding over such an incredibly successful series of books. It really is remarkable. I think it must be one of the most successful anthology series, apart from all the other successes. So I just wanted to ask a question, Soraya, about the not to reproduce. Because as you know in the book that we've done looking at changing infertilities around the globe, there's a number of countries where the decision not to reproduce has become much more of a kind of vocal rallying cry to critique the government. And also a kind of existential, cry from younger people about the lack of recognition of the precarity of their situation generally, not just reproductively. And in China, there's the famous case of the young man being arrested, who's threatened with, 3 generations of his family being persecuted if he didn't accompany the police. And he said, there isn't going to be a future generation. We are the last generation, and that went viral. And I'm just wondering about the not to reproduce in Iran, and there's maybe a different connection to the women life freedom movement, which is in many ways an anti-government movement,
Yes.
well, not exclusively. And, is that almost paralleled by the not to reproduce as a new way of addressing a failure, a really chronic failure of the government to acknowledge the realities of its own population vis-a-vis choices about having families and so forth. Do you think those two things might be linked? And maybe can you just say a little bit more about not to reproduce as a position in a way today?
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. As you know about the article that you and Marcia, your major groundbreaking volume you two are editing, my chapter, that's why I have put a question mark here, saying to reproduce or not to reproduce. From my observation and studies, question is not about reproducing or not reproducing, because most people want to have families, most people want to have children, most people have 1 or 2 children, not enough to replenish the population. So it's not about reproduction, it's about autonomy. People want to reproduce on their own terms. I mean, as I say, even people who are in white marriage with cohabitation, they want to have children, but they're not allowed to, so they migrate, they go out of the country. So I'm not saying their number is significant, but it's indicative. Therefore, yes, no, I think that's my argument, that really the reproductive core, fundamental reproductive values have not basically altered very much. It is a shift between the identity, personhood, and how much it means to be a parent anymore, and how many, basically it boils down to the value of children, I think. What having a child means altogether. Why do we have children? Why don't we want to have too many children? I mean, there are all of those things. When the state takes charge of aged people in age of pension, you don't need so many children anymore. The health of people have improved of children. Economically also, this is a factor, but not wanting too many children. Women especially want their freedom. They want to be doing other things rather than spending all the urbanization, smaller size family. All of those things have contributed towards a smaller size family. So I think it's not about not reproducing. It's about other factors.
Okay, we have a
Tara
question which
is
has come in. No, we've answered those. This is from Arezu Rezayan.
Yes.
Do you think it is still possible for anthropologists who have studied in the Western countries to do anthropological fieldwork on the issues of sexuality, gender, family, kinship, and IVF under the Conservative government? We know that few anthropologists were arrested.
Yes, of course. Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm non-anthropologist. I've also been arrested.
Yes,
it's not to do.
they're
It's not
quite
to do
Catholic
with
in their
anthropology.
apology.
Well, I really think one problem I do have with what is called anthropology through online surveys. I mean, it's good for sociology, statistics, other things. But anthropology, as I said, we are flies on the wall as anthropologists. We just sit and observe and make sense and join the dots. And you can't do that unless you live among people. But it depends on if you, I know the anthropologists who want to go and do field work need permission, they need to be ethical permission, they do all of those things, which makes it obvious that they are actually going to do it. And in the current regime that we have in Iran, where people are taken as hostage, there is always a danger to go back. But if you are part of a family and go and visit your family without any intention of actually carrying out active field work, then you can sort of actually do some studies. Also, if you are really going to look at what Iranian cultural values are, you can also look at the diaspora, because the cultural values get reinforced in the diaspora. They don't get weaker. Whereas in Iran, what I call social change rather than cultural transformation is people have access to the internet. I mean, Iran has got the highest rate of, second highest rate of rhinoplasty, no surgery, Botox. These are the sort of things that you get modernization and globalization on the internet, but it doesn't affect your, if somebody wants to have Botox and no surgery, it's because they want to become acceptable marriage partners. You know, it is linked back to your actual cultural values. It's not because you want to be modern. I mean, we had one study of our students who walked around across the Iran and said, it's not about, you remember that, Helen, it's not about actually wanting to be like Western nose, if you then get your nose, it's about perfection. Your future mother will expect you to be perfect, so you have got to have a perfect nose. So what is that? It goes back to family and kinship and expectations of your future daughter-in-law. I mean, there are so many layers and subtleties of culture which are the driving force. I mean, just what appears to be, oh, we all want to be like the West through globalization and access to the internet, has got its roots back into culture. That's my argument. I may be wrong, but this is based on my finding. Every time I've been in Iran, since the revolution, I've been going back every year. Every 6 months, I found change has happened. I had been asking myself, has the society changed? But when you stay there and live among the people, you find, no, it really hasn't changed. You know, I've got, 10 years ago, I was in Iran, and my cousin, when she found out I was working on infertility, she crept up to me and wanted more information because her daughter couldn't have children, but they wouldn't tell people. You know, it's just such a stigma, infertility, or other aspects, you know. You lose faith if you're infertile, you're a failure in society. You know, all of those things all have still the roots in the culture.
I do want to say there's been wonderful fieldwork-based anthropological work done on Iran. There are many wonderful books written by anthropologists of Iran, And unfortunately, I do think that is going to, right now at least, be very difficult. Field work in Iran is going to become more and more difficult, and there have been many arrests.
Yes.
Many arrests. It's not a good time for
No.
anthropology
Oh, no,
in
no,
Iran,
it's-
which is why a book like this, which is 4 decades of research, is such an important book. So I have to say, about so many different aspects of a family life and political life in the country, which would be very difficult to produce by another anthropologist.
Well, thank you so much. But I also find, that, for example, there have been studies done in Canada about the attitude of young people brought up in Canada, Iranians, about hymenoplasty, the restoring of virginity, for example, which is rife in Iran. Unmarried girls who have lost their virginity have to be seen to be virgins at marriage. So hymenoplasty is such a industry.
Yes.
And it was exercised at such an extent that a question was asked of one of the sources of emulation back in 2003, Ayatollah Rouhani, not the president, another Rouhani. And was hymenoplasty all right? And he immediately issued a fatwa, said yes, it was all right. There was no difference between rebuild hymen
And the real thing.
and then the study among the people in Canada by an Iranian, and I've referred to it in the book, talks about how the Iranians living and brought up in Canada still value virginity. In the early days after the revolution, Iranian boys brought up in the West would go to Iran because they wanted virgin girls. To marry virgins.
The thing about the hymen operation, of course, is that they value virginity too. It doesn't have to be true virginity.
No, well, exactly. He said, the Ayatollah said, there is no difference.
Yeah.
It's okay as long as you're seen to be virgin. It's okay. So, what I'm really saying is, this is there was another study by Farahani among the university students about whether they wanted to be virgins at marriage, and most girls said this, they wanted to be virgins at marriage. So, these things have not gone away, it's just there, and,
We have 2 more questions. One is a very good pointed one, I think, which is from Paprine Nahar.
Oh, yes.
My question is about the legal rights of surrogate mothers, gestational carriers. Is there any legal protection for surrogate mothers in Iran? And if so, how is that implemented in practice?
Well, yes, all these reproductive third-party donations in Iran, all of them, except for embryo donation, had been allowed through fatwas. When it came to embryo donation, no amount of interpretation of the Quran could find an answer about embryo donation. They had to pass a law. And these other practices, like surrogacy, are following the law about surrogacy, the law of embryo donation about surrogacy. But really, as I've argued elsewhere, the practice of reproductive technologies is a triangle, which is formed of the patients, the fatwas, the practitioners. So these change from clinic to clinic, how every clinic wants to interpret that. And the surrogate mothers usually sign a contract. Is that right, Mansour? Yes. Sign a contract is between the clinic and the owners of the embryo and the surrogate mother. The arrangements change from one clinic to another. Equally, I have come across doctors who are highly religious, and they said because the law of embryo donation is not clear, they say Muslims can donate to each other, but they don't say whether the Sunni can give to the Shia embryo or you cannot. I am not practicing it because I'm religious. So it's very much changes from one clinic to another. And as I say, the enforcement is not really there.
Yeah, so the surrogate mother and so forth in the end may well not be protected, even though there is a law.
Yes, I did actually. The owners of the embryo have an interest to look after the surrogate mother because of their own child. There are cases with surrogate mothers who want back to come and claim, but the way the fatwas have been given is that the child belongs to his biological parents. And if the embryo belongs not to the surrogate mother, then she has no right.
Right. Okay.
I mean, it's such a vast
Minefield.
legally.
I think we have one last question then.
Yes.
Tara's question.
Sorry?
Have we taken care of Tara's question? Because
Tara,
it's
yes,
right
Tara
here,
asked
she
two
keeps
questions.
saying,
Tara.
you missed-
Thanks a lot for the fascination.
Yeah, that we dealt with the issue of reproductive
Oh,
rebellion.
okay,
We
because
dealt
she
with
keep-
that.
Right.
No, we have another question from Sohaila Shahani. Last week there was a publicity all over the city. I want a playmate. The picture was either a girl or a boy with a toy, frowning. This replaces the quote, the less the children, the better the situation of the family. What do you think will be the response to this? I mean, what they're saying is we've got
I don't
another.
understand. What was the
Well,
description?
basically, you've got posters appearing in the town of a child who has a toy and is frowning because he or she wants a playmate.
Another child, a
Another
brother
child,
or a
another
sister.
child,
Yeah.
you see.
Oh.
And this, Sohaila notes, is very different than the slogan, the less the children, the better the situation of the family.
So I don't live in Iran, you live in Iran, perhaps you could answer that question better than I do.
Well, surely the answer you can give is that, it's just another round of this cycle.
Well, absolutely. I think, okay, these posters are put up. Some people for either financial interest, because they think the government is going to give them land and money, and young men are exempt from military service if they have more than 3 children. Well, I mean, military service is about, at the age of 19, how could you have 3 children by then, So anyway.
IVF, triplets.
all of those things may convince some people to follow the government's propaganda. But most people actually just ignore it and go about their own business. I mean, people do what it suits them, and as I say, if they want to do something that suits them, they will find rounds of bypassing government policies and instructions. And it's amazing how much people can do that. We have seen it time and again under all sorts of policies, not just to do with population. When it doesn't suit people, the policies, they bypass them.
Well, we did have a question earlier on about conservatives, so I think...
Everywhere, absolutely.
Anyway, I think we are running to the limit of our time as given. I don't think there's anywhere I could possibly summarize our discussion. It has been very, very active and diverse and interesting. What I do have to do is to thank the 3 people, Marianne, Soraya and Marsha, who are the real players in all of this. And if you like, we can all give ourselves a round of applause. Thank you all for coming.
Can I just say one last word? I didn't thank enough Marianne for your open-mindedness. Without Marcia, we wouldn't have been here. Marcia, your contribution has been absolutely vital. From the minute you joined, this series flourished, and then when Phil joined us, you brought an additional, with your interest in demography of health and anthropology of demography. That has been another rich contribution. So I can only thank you all, and David Parkin, who actually, without his support, this wouldn't have taken up. So thank you to
all of you, because it's not my field, but you're always so encouraging to students and supportive, whether or not that was your area. So honey gets more results than vinegar. Not everybody at Oxford.
Thank you.
She is a real honey.
Quite right.
Thank you very much.